I was talking to my mom on the phone today. This might be a little off topic. It's her birthday. And I mentioned to her that I'd lost another friend as a result of the message I transmit. And she said, well, maybe you shouldn't talk about that sort of thing. So maybe I shouldn't. But we're already scheduled, and I'm already here, and you're already here. So let's just do that. Imagine that you are standing on the top floor, we'll say the 7th floor, and you're looking out at the horizon. It's a beautiful day. It's 9:30 in the morning. You're having your first cup of coffee. And then you see the most dreaded thing you could possibly imagine. You see a mushroom cloud there on the horizon, not far away. And you know what the mushroom cloud means. It means that somebody has just dropped a nuclear bomb, and you're going to be hit with the shock wave, and so you're going to die. Now imagine a 20-foot steel I-beam comes spinning through the air, and it's headed right at your head. It's going to hit you in 3 seconds, and there's nothing you can do, and you're dead by the time I finish this sentence. Miraculously, the I-beam flies over your head. The voice on the radio calls out that the shock wave from the nuclear detonation will hit you in 3 minutes. You didn't even have time to react when it was 3 seconds. You've been given a reprieve. You have 3 minutes. 3 minutes seems like a pretty long time compared to 3 seconds. You can call somebody on the phone, if the phones still work. You can scratch out a note telling somebody you love them. Perhaps the person you love most is in the room with you. You can have a final goodbye. Rinse and repeat through 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks. Let's change the scenario a little bit. You go to your medical doctor. Your medical doctor takes a few tests. You've been complaining about a pain in your lower back, and the tests indicate upon first diagnosis that you're going to die in 3 weeks. And you think, wow, that's an incredibly short period of time. You seek a second opinion. The second opinion comes in the same day, and it says that instead you have 3 months, plus or minus a week. 3 months seems like forever. If you're given a terminal diagnosis of 3 weeks, 3 months seems like a very long time. In fact, it is a very long time. In 3 months, if you have the money, you can visit probably everybody you love. Probably every single person that you want to see, you can see. In 3 months, you can see the things that you most want to see in the world. If you have a bucket list, you have time to cross off at least a couple of things in 3 months. Thus are the 7 threes, from including 3 seconds, 3 minutes, 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, and 3 years, reminders for us to live with urgency. Any moment might be your last, as Homer pointed out in the Iliad some 2,800 years ago. And almost certainly any moment is not your last. How do you live with this balance, with this notion that any moment might be your last, to live with that urgency, to have the conversations that you want to have, to leave nothing unfinished with the people you love in your life? How do you pursue that kind of life, that kind of urgent life, while also recognizing that any moment is almost certainly not your last? That you don't just have 3 seconds, that you don't just have 3 minutes, that with great certainty you have more than 3 weeks. I can pretty much guarantee that everybody in this room will still be alive in 3 months. I cannot make that promise for 3 years. 3 years in the midst of abrupt climate change is a very long time. 3 years in the midst of the 6th mass extinction is a very long time. 3 months can be a long time depending upon how we live. If we live with urgency, if we live with death in mind, 3 months can seem like a very long time. I've been living with urgency since I first came to the conclusion that we collectively have a terminal diagnosis. In 2002, I realized that we had triggered so many self-reinforcing feedback loops that we Probably don't have long. And yet here we are, 17 years later. Living with urgency is exhausting. That's why I look so tired. I had no gray hair when I reached that conclusion. That's not true. I'd been advising graduate students for years, so the gray hair was all there. Okay, let's do another exercise. You might be familiar with the child on the beach saving the starfish, but for those of you who aren't, I'm going to tell the story anyway. So a young child, we'll say he's 5, is walking along the beach, and there are thousands and thousands of starfish washed up on the beach, and they're all going to die. And so the little boy is walking along and picking up each starfish and throwing it into the ocean to save them, one at a time. And thank you. And a cynical old man looking a lot like me comes along and says, "Boy, you're never going to save them all. You're not making any difference at all in the world. What are you doing wasting your time?" And the little boy picks one up and he says, "I'll make a difference to this one." And he throws it in the ocean. And that's what we have. That's what we have in our lives. So I suspect that what we have is us and the ocean and the starfish. We have the ability to influence relatively little in our lives. And that influence can be profound. The interaction I have with Cachet in the short time I've been with her, the interaction that I have with Pauline, my partner behind the camera, these are the things that really matter. They matter to her and to her and to me. And most of us, lacking superhero status, will go through life having an impact on the relatively few people who also have an impact on us. So I think that's where our own superpower lies, is with us as individuals and the people we interact with. I want to thoroughly disparage the notion of hope to start with, because I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a lie. I begin with this quote from Stephen Jenkinson, who's been involved in what he calls the death trade all of his adult life. He's a Canadian, and he points out that the great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the 4-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things as they are. Hope is a lie. Hope is the promise of a future that doesn't come. And he points out that grief is required to proceed knowing what we know. I'll tend to turn to my favorite source on all things linguistic, Merriam and Webster. Hope is to cherish a desire with anticipation, or to want something to happen or to be true. To want something to happen, that sounds like wishful thinking to me. Hope in the absence of action is a wish. And yet we've all been indoctrinated. We all grew up with this idea that hope was unimpeachably good, that you don't say anything bad about hope. Hope, faith, and love are the big 3. Right? The ménage à trois of getting along in the world is hope, faith, and love. So I think hope is a bad idea. And to bring us up to date on what Jenkinson means by grief, I turn to the Grief Recovery Institute for a definition of grief, and that's wishing for a different past. So think about the people you've lost that you grieve. The problem there is that you didn't have time to complete the relationship. You didn't have time to have the conversation that you needed to have. You didn't have time to say, "I love you," before that person died or left your life. And neither did they. You didn't have time to apologize. You didn't have time to seek an apology. The relationship is left undone. So if grief is wishing for a different past and hope is wishing for a different future than the one that is likely to come, what are we left with? We're left with here and now. I turn to the peer-reviewed journal literature. There's a paper that came out in May of 2019. See how I use my time machine there? I don't do that very often, so this is a privileged moment for you. As with many peer-reviewed articles, this particular journal, Clinical Psychology Forum, publishes a month or two in advance of the publication date. And the abstract from this paper indicates that there is a belief in the positive future. That's what we call hope. That's what hope is. Hope is wishing for something to happen in the future. Imagine, if you will, that it's World War II, and we were all so addicted to hope, we all just imagined that it would work out just fine. That's what hope is. Hope is wishing for a desirable future. It's the belief in a favorable future. Had we wished for a future, had we desired a good future during World War II, we'd all be speaking German today. But instead, it was that other four-letter word that is on the flip side of the coin that has the other four-letter word on the one side, hope. The other side of that coin has fear. We were motivated by fear to create the Manhattan Project, to grow 50% of the food grown in this country in our yards. I don't appreciate being driven by fear. I don't appreciate being driven by hope. I think they're twin sides of the same con job, personally. But if you're looking for action, if you're looking for radical action, fear is clearly the way to go. Hope is not going to get it done. If we hope about the future, we don't do a thing. We just wait. Because after all, we're hoping for the best. Surely it'll turn out that way, and it has. My entire life has been nothing but a dream. It's been incredible. All I lack from when I was a kid is a flying car. That's it. Every other dream has pretty much come true. I mean, the big thing when I was 8 was we wouldn't have these telephones that you had to stand in one place and make sparks to call somebody. Instead, we would be walking around with these things, and they could see you and you could see them. And it would be free. And we call that Skype or Zoom now. That's an incredible advance in technology. And so many others. Did you think that was free? Did you think we could have that amazing advance in technology at every level and it wouldn't cost us something? Of course it does. Of course there are technological costs. Cell phones, the classic example is the coltan, which comes from a relatively small region in Africa, almost all of it, the rare earth that is coltan, a complex ore that provides the batteries for smartphones, for cell phones. What's the cost? A whole bunch of dead women and children of color. But we don't hear about that, so we don't think about that. Interestingly, in the 1960s and through the early 1970s, hope was so powerful in this country that medical doctors were encouraged, including by medical ethicists, to lie to their patients. To lie to their patients in the name of hope. You don't tell somebody that they have a terminal diagnosis. You might tell their family, you might not even tell them. This was only 50 years ago. 50 years ago, medical doctors regularly lied to their patients in the name of hope. Today, we call that malpractice. Unless it's at the level of society. If it's at the level of society, climate scientists lie about the future all the time. They disparage anybody who doesn't believe in hope, the belief in a favorable future. So this paper that's in the Clinical Psychology Forum makes a link between how medical doctors, with the support of the medical ethics community, used to lie to people on a regular basis. And now we have entire disciplines, including the corporate media and paid climate scientists, who refuse to tell the full truth about climate change in the name of hope. So I'm going to talk briefly, because I've used up almost all the time that was allotted to me, which is fine. I want to talk about anticipatory grief at scale, and here I'm thinking about, by anticipatory grief, I'm thinking about, when somebody close to you has a terminal diagnosis and they're on their deathbed. You know that. These days, it's fairly commonplace for somebody to be given a few days or a few weeks more, but they're under their deathbed and nobody expects a favorable outcome. That's anticipatory grief. You know the person is going to die. You can experience pain already as a result of that near-term death. That's anticipatory grief. At scale, here I'm thinking about the relatively few times in history that we've known about many, many people dying pretty much all at the same time. So think 9/11, think World War II. So there are a few times we can invoke large-scale numbers of humans dying off. With a better understanding of history, we can go back and look at the genocide carried out to a great extent by the United States to get rid of indigenous peoples. That's scale. And the genocide continues in the United States, albeit not at the level of human beings so much as with non-human species. As a conservation biologist, I'm well aware of the 200 species we're driving to extinction every day. Most people aren't. 200 species every day. Extinction is forever. I don't know much about the characteristics of hospice. I've never been in hospice. I've never had anybody close to me enter into hospice. So it seems like I'm the worst person to be at the front of the room at this point. How do we scale up from palliative end-of-life care for individuals to the level of society, knowing that our time is short not only for us as individuals, but also for our species in light of the sixth mass extinction and abrupt climate change that is ongoing? How do we do that? I'm not sure. What I'm trying to do in my presentations lately is to provoke a conversation. And I would love for this conversation to extend until after I'm gone and beyond. I would love for some of you to get together willingly, obviously, and have a conversation at the tavern or at the library on a monthly basis about how do we proceed? How do we proceed with the full knowledge that of course we're all going to die, as Cachet pointed out, but also that our species is going to extinct as with every other species to ever come into being on the planet. The latest one was just reported within the last week on an island in the Philippines, a species newly discovered in the genus Homo. So, named after the island it was found on, the Luzon Island, Luzonensis was thus named after it was extinct. It existed 50 to 65,000 years ago. We only found out about it very recently, and it's gone. And we will be too, because every species goes extinct. And then there's the question, if you see something, should you say something? If you know what I claim to know, should you tell your friends? Should you tell your family? Or should you just leave them alone? I don't know. It depends upon the people. I used to tell everybody, I always request the aisle seat in the plane so I can stretch my right knee out because it hurts all the time. And if I stretch my right knee out, then they always hit it with that cart and make it hurt regularly even more, which is just awesome. At least then my left knee is fine. So call it my sacrificial knee, if you will. And then there was always some person sitting next to me in the window seat. And I'm going to go back a little bit in time to when I was 6, and I'm 2 weeks into first grade. They didn't have kindergarten where I went to school. I'm 2 weeks into first grade. I come home 2 weeks into first grade, and my poor 4.5-year-old sister is immediately subjected to me trying to teach her to read. I'm not a teacher. I just learned these words myself. I just learned how to read Spot and Puff, and I'm insisting that she knows what they are. And I did the same thing. For years, I did the same thing on every airplane I was ever on. This poor sucker next to me would say something ridiculous to invite the conversation about human extinction, she would say, "Hello." And I'm like, "Oh, you know about it too? Let's talk." Only one time in all those conversations did I have the woman sitting next to me actually try to open the exit door and escape in mid-flight. That's when I shut up. I can take a hint. So I don't know when you should say something, but probably you shouldn't necessarily. This is a topic that, an idea that reached me far too late, far after I made all those people miserable, because, you know, misery loves company, especially miserable company. And so why would I not? But maybe you don't want to tell people in your life. Maybe they don't want to know. I have an opening question now that I ask people if there's an asteroid coming, and we know, whoever the we is, if we know with great certainty when it's going to strike the Earth and therefore destroy all habitat for human beings, do you want to know? And if the person says no, then I just stop right there. But almost everybody says yes because they're curious, because it sounds like some sort of secret they'd be in on it. And then I tell them, and then they say, "I didn't want to know that." But at least then you have full disclosure. So that's the question. If you know, should you tell somebody? So you might start with that question. You know, I have a secret of sorts. I have come across this new information that is based upon the reliable, refereed, peer-reviewed journal literature. So, do you want to know? Not everybody wants to know. Maybe give them a chance to take their way out. It's not like we haven't been here before. There have been 5 previous mass extinction events in planetary history. A mass extinction event is defined as one in which at least 50% of the species on the planet disappear in a relatively short period of time. And relatively short at geological timescales, of course, is something a little different than what we're talking about today. So consider, for example, the Permian 252.2 million years ago, in which 96% of species were lost as a result of abrupt heating. This is the closest one we have to today's 6th mass extinction, is the Permian, when we lost 96% of the species on Earth. That's a lot. The current extinction event, the 6th, is proceeding at 10 times the rate of the Permian extinction event. It's taking out species 10 times as fast, but not that cricket. And that's undoubtedly as a result of us pouring greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at 10 times the rate as occurred during the Permian event. So of course things are going 10 times as fast as they were then. According to a very recent paper in the peer-reviewed literature, actually published on the 8th of April of this year in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, it takes at least 10 million years to recover from the relatively well-studied in Cretaceous mass extinction event. So that's the sort of recovery time that we're looking at after a mass extinction event. So those of you who are interested in going into a bunker, as I did, before I fully understood the 6th mass extinction, before I fully understood 10 times the rate of the Permian event, before I fully understood the catastrophic uncontrolled meltdown of the world's 450 plus nuclear power plants, I went into my bunker. So if you're thinking about doing that, that's a bad idea, because 10 million years is a long time to wait. At one point, we all thought we were going to live forever, and we thought it was a good idea. Not anymore. We're in the midst of the 6th, according to the stunningly conservative peer-reviewed journal literature. We were entering the 6th mass extinction in June 2015. That was actually a decade and a half, at least, after scientists had been publishing books for the general public about the 6th mass extinction. And Ceballos, the lead author, points out that it would take many millions of years to recover. Now, as a result of the paper that just came out a few days ago, we know better than that. It will take about 10 million years or so. And then in the subsequent paper, we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. To my knowledge, this is the first time the term biological annihilation has appeared in the peer-reviewed journal literature. Scientists don't write like this, and they don't talk like this. It's an incredibly conservative group of people adhering to a very conservative process getting published in the peer-reviewed literature. As the second author on this paper, and also an author on this paper, concludes, we're toxifying the entire planet. That's Paul Ehrlich, relatively well known for his book, The Population Bomb, which came out in 1968. Some of you might be familiar with it. He co-wrote it with his wife, Anne, and both of their names have appeared on many of the books they published since then, 20 or 25 books. Her name did not appear on The Population Bomb because, of course, in 1968, publishers believed that women didn't have anything to say about controlling the human population, so her name couldn't actually be on there. People actually think like this. I'm astonished we made it this long. I'm going to talk briefly about functional extinction. Functional extinction results either from total reproductive failure as a result of, for example, not having a sufficient population size. So minimum viable population is the term conservation biologists use. We have to have enough genetic material remaining to sustain a species. Typically, it takes two to tango, but it takes more than that to keep a species hanging on. Or it could be loss of habitat. I'm going to focus on loss of habitat here because by the time we get to total reproductive failure, we're talking about very few people on the planet, and we wouldn't be among them. We're not going to be the last 20 or 200 or 2,000 that it takes to maintain genetic material sitting here in this room. I can pretty much guarantee that. Here's a paper that just came out within the last month, and it was a major synthetic approach put out by the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System. And in it, the authors conclude that an increase of 1.5 degrees, that's 1.5 degrees above the 1750 baseline, at that point, that's the maximum the planet can tolerate. Should temperatures increase further, at worst, we would experience the extinction of humankind altogether. So this sounds bad. 1.5 degrees sounds really, really horrible. We're at least 1 3/4 now. I would argue that we are functionally extinct. We were at 1.73 more than 2 years ago. The planet has done nothing except get warmer since then. Nobody's done an analysis as Sam Carana did 2 years ago. And then subsequently, 3 refereed peer-reviewed journal articles came out in support of the idea that we could in fact experience such an abrupt release of methane from the relatively shallow sea floor of the Arctic Ocean at any time. So they've been vindicated, and they never should have been disparaged to begin with. It's not just from the ocean, there's also terrestrial permafrost. Methane released from terrestrial permafrost is typically measured in parts per billion, and this study in Yamal in Siberia, Yamal interpreted directly means end of the world. So great place for that research. Here they measured the methane release in parts per million, not parts per billion. So that's actually 8.5 parts per million of methane release. Methane is 100 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So that's an enormous amount of methane being released from the permafrost right now. And as a consequence, we're seeing a dramatic increase in atmospheric methane at various measurement points in the atmosphere. The third means by which we could cause our own extinction is continued industrial activity. Civilization is a heat engine. No matter how we power it, according to wonderful work or horrible work, depending on your perspective, by Tim Garrett, head of the Atmospheric Sciences program at the University of Utah. He indicates through his research, based on the laws of thermodynamics, not the strong suggestions, but the laws of thermodynamics, that civilization is a heat engine. No matter how we power it, Wind turbines, solar panels, wave power, fossil fuels, civilization is a heat engine. And this is the press release that came out, and I just extract a few words here. Garret treats civilization like a heat engine so that everybody can see them. Because civilization itself is the heat engine that's driving to extinction 200 species a day, that's fouling the air and dirtying the water. Yes, to a very, very limited extent, it's you and me and the other 7.7 billion people on the planet, but really it's this set of living arrangements that we call civilization that we were born into. And we didn't have any choice. We didn't get to vote for it. I vote anarchism. Wait, anarchists don't vote. And no anarchist is going to run for office. So there's only two things wrong with that problem. So we're born into this disaster capitalism that we're all part of. Try to opt out. Just try it. I dare you. I tried. 10 years ago, I leapt from the monetary system thinking I was going to make a difference. Living off-grid, growing all my own food. You can only imagine what happens when a lifelong academic tries to grow food and build structures. I could barely distinguish between a screwdriver and a zucchini, and suddenly I'm out there milking goats and making cheese. And you probably know how many people followed along. Here I was, a 49-year-old distinguished professor who was showing the way. We'll call me Professor White Guy. Who would not follow? I'm like one of the most privileged people on the planet. Who would not go along with me and milk my goats and grow my asparagus? As it turns out, everybody didn't go along with me. Everybody so far. And it's a good thing because not only is civilization a heat engine, but decreased industrial activity, turning down civilization or turning it off altogether, heats up the planet even faster. Oh my. That sounds like a catch-22, doesn't it? Oh, the horrors. When I discovered this, I realized the horrible mistake I'd made. Yeah, I'm a slow learner. It took a while. According to the first paper on the topic was published by James Hansen and colleagues in December 2011, and they pointed to cessation of all industrial activity causing the global average temperature to rise by 1.2 plus or minus 0.2 degrees Celsius in 5 days. And I'll get to the why in a minute. 5 days. 5 days. I mentioned how important the rate of change is. 5 days is the blink of an eye. No species can keep up with that rate of change. That's like you're putting a snake at the Indianapolis 500 starting point and saying, go. And the snake's like, and suddenly, boom, boom, there's 400 tires running over it. That's us with a 1 degree global average temperature rise in 5 days. And all the previous research has been found conservative by one of the leading journals, the journal Science. And so we've underestimated the aerosol masking effect. And one way that we could have reduced industrial activity is through a financial collapse. So this is what I was cheering for the whole time I was living out there in the wilds of New Mexico. I was cheering for reduced industrial activity to save the planet. Because up until 2011, December 2011, it was pretty obvious that this set of living arrangements was destroying the living planet. Just driving it to dust, basically. Well, and there's a bunch of organizations, Idle No More, what's Derek Jensen's organization, Deep Green Resistance, that are continuing to point out that we need to turn off civilization right now. Well, if we do, we're all dead even faster, and so is every other species on the planet. And here's why. At the same time, industrial activity produces methane and carbon dioxide and water vapor and 40 other greenhouse gases that are warming the planet, thus global warming. At the same time that is going on, industrial activity also puts the aerosols up into the atmosphere that act as an umbrella. So we're producing these greenhouse gases which serve as a blanket, which keep the long wave radiation trapped once it enters the atmosphere, but a bunch of it never enters the atmosphere. We got the blanket and the umbrella. The blanket holds the heat close to the Earth once the Earth gets heated. The aerosols, most notably the sulfates, keep the sunshine from even entering into the atmosphere and heating the Earth. So, most notably by burning coal, and especially dirty coal that's high in sulfur, clean coal is low in sulfur, so it produces relatively little in the way of sulfates. So, as it turns out, clean coal is bad, dirty coal is good, night is day. It just gets crazier every minute. This is the catch-22 of abrupt climate change. We continue to heat the planet by producing greenhouse gases. We're now at more than 410 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we'll never see 410 parts per million again. And that continues to warm the planet. That's probably more carbon dioxide than we've had in the atmosphere in the last 3 million years, approximately 10 times the run of our species, Homo sapiens. And yet, if we cease or even reduce the amount of greenhouse gases we'd put into the atmosphere, we warm the planet even faster because of the aerosol masking effect. Doomed if you do, doomed if you don't. I think that's how that expression goes. So, we're done. We're done, and it's stunning to me that we're all here having this conversation. Because we need to drive the train wreck of civilization ever faster down the tracks, because this civilization, like all others, grows and then it dies. And we haven't killed industrial civilization yet, and that's why we're still here. Whew. Never thought those words would come out of my mouth. Item number 5, a decline in grain harvest as a result, for example, of the 83% decline in earthworms found in a study conducted last year and published in the peer-reviewed literature. Or maybe from the floods that are destroying the grain crop in the Midwestern United States right now. This civilization, like all its predecessors, depends upon the ability to grow, store, and distribute grains at scale. Without those grains, we don't have the ability to store food and therefore get through the hard times. And this year's grain crop is looking pretty ugly right now. Item 6, an ice-free Arctic in 2016. That's when it was projected to occur by this paper in the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences. 2016 plus or minus 3 years. Let's see, that would be 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. We've dodged a few bullets so far. Will we do it again? It's the last bullet in the chamber. I don't know. So far, it's not looking good. This is the Arctic sea ice extent for April 12th of this year. And here's the line. And here's all the previous years. And you can see it's headed the wrong way. But maybe we'll dodge another bullet. I would be very happy about it. And whereas I used to exclaim the horrors of civilization and point out that it's driving us all to an early grave, now I point out that it's doing that, and by terminating industrial civilization, we drive ourselves to the grave even faster. An ice-free Arctic is among the best ways I know to drive us to extinction even faster. We haven't had an ice-free Arctic in at least 3 million years. And the president of Finland summarized the extensive refereed journal literature on the topic, pointing out at a press conference a couple of years ago with President Donald Trump in the Oval Office, when he said, if we lose the Arctic, we lose the globe. That is reality. You can imagine how well this was received by your president. Suddenly there was a change of subject. Who can blame him? I don't want to talk about our demise either. So what happens when we lose the Arctic ice? We have a methane release that would warm the planet up to 1.3 degrees, as pointed out by Shakova and colleagues in that 2008 paper. We have a loss of albedo that would virtually immediately cause a 1.6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise. We have loss of the aerosol masking effect, or global dimming, as a result of removing that umbrella that has been estimated up to about 2.7. So that's a total of 5.2, and I haven't seen any literature to indicate what would be the increase in temperature as a result of latent heat or the water vapor feedback, but they would add, they wouldn't subtract. And there's another dozen or so self-reinforcing feedback loops that I'm not mentioning here. So keep in mind that 5-point-something degrees Celsius temperature rise in a very short period of time, a matter of a few years after the initial ice-free Arctic. And it could be that the El Nino that's currently underway, that just got started within the last month or so, causes the temperatures to go up high enough to overheat the planet beyond the ability to grow grains. This is the one I'm a lot less sure about than with the other 6. Going back to Shakova and colleagues. So the El Nino is the best example we have of the planetary ocean acting like a battery. The planetary ocean stores carbon dioxide and it stores heat. And during an El Nino southern oscillation, that carbon dioxide is released and the heat is released as well. So this El Nino event, the biggest one we know about, the real monster from 97, 98, is the one that is commonly pointed to by climate change deniers when they say we haven't had any warming in the last 20 years. So they point to this particular data point and say, look, it's the same temperature it was then. Therefore, you climate change people are out of your minds. So it could be that this particular El Nino takes us to here or here. We don't know yet. And we don't know what the tipping point is either for loss of human habitat. So I'm less sure about item 7 than I am about items 1 through 6. So there's a 7 distinct paths, or what I should say is 6 distinct paths plus 1 that we really don't know about that could drive us to extinction. So we're in the midst of exponential change. And most of us are not at all familiar with exponential change. We don't live that way. We live with linear in mind, just like every other species on the planet. That's what we were, quote, designed to do. That's what we evolved to do, is to live with linear change in mind. After all, we pretty accurately predict the near future based upon the recent past. We do that as individuals, we do that as a society, and it has worked great. For about 315,000 years, Homo sapiens has done that, and it's working just fine. But exponential change, that's something new.
Everybody knows about playing with dominoes, but what you may not know is that a domino can knock over another domino, which is about 1.5 times larger. So what I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I will carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes. And the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready? Boom. That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, the last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
According to a paper in November 13th issue of Scientific Reports, titled Co-extinctions, annihilate, there's that word again. Second time I've ever heard it, and they were both within the last 2 years. Annihilate planetary life during extreme environmental change. And what Strona and Bradshaw pointed out in their paper is that extreme environmental change is a rise in global average temperature of 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. Remember I pointed out that when we lose the Arctic ice, the global average temperature would rise around 5.6 degrees Celsius in a very short period of time. That's within the range of co-extinctions or the domino effect causing multiple species to go extinct. And a major media outlet in Australia pointed out the day after the paper was published that climate change may cause mass extinctions. Well, duh, since they've caused essentially all the mass extinctions so far. That seems like a reasonable assumption. And their subtitle is New Research Found that Extreme Climate Change Risks an Extinction Event that Could Annihilate All Life on Earth. And that's at 5 or 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise. The senior author of the paper points out that even the most adaptable species, and here he's probably thinking about humans, we're very adaptable. Even the most adaptable species succumb to extinction when the less tolerant species on which they depend disappear. So we depend upon an enormous array of life out there for our own survival. And it's not all out there, of course, some of it's in here. We're comprised of dozens of species, and if you irritate just one of them that's in your gut, you're not going to have a nice day. And that's just a little thing. Little things really matter. Little things pollinate the food. Little things filter the water so that we can drink it. Little things decompose the forest and turn it into soil. Little things really matter. I already told you this story. This is a great example of me to show off my Photoshop skills. Oh, look, there's that beam flying through the air. That's nice photoshopping. There's the medical doctor. Here's the children at the beach. This is an opportunity for you to show off my partner's photoshopping skills. The beach and everything in the background is a different picture. In fact, it's taken in New Zealand. The children are the children of her caretaker at her property in Belize, in Central America, and the starfish are dried up on the wall of her sister in Florida. And you can see that we went to the same Photoshop school. It's almost the same thing. And so I just want to point out again something I said at the very beginning, that any moment might be our last. Interestingly, Homer in the Iliad, again writing about 2,800 years ago, in the previous paragraph to this one, he pointed out why the gods envy us. The gods envy us because any moment might be our last. They envy us because everything is more beautiful, because we are doomed. Those poor gods have to live forever. You will never be lovelier than you are now. The gods can't say that. It's like the same old, got up again today for, the 4 billionth time. The day is exactly the same as it was yesterday from the perspective of the gods. We will never be here again. We will never be here again. You're probably not too happy about being here the first time. In light of the fact that our time is short, and here's another example. I was on tour in Western Europe 4 years ago, and in early March, the world's oldest human being at the time turned 117 years old. So about a month ago and 4 years ago, the world's oldest human being turned 117. And at her birthday party, she was asked, what was that like? And she said, it seemed rather short. It seemed rather short. We will never be here again. How are you going to act? I don't recommend this strategy.
Who does that?
I used to do this all the time. I don't do this anymore. I used to teach in the classroom, and I've experienced great joy as a result of teaching in the classroom. Just a couple of months ago, I met one of my former students 18 years after I had her in class, 18 years after I'd seen her the first time, and for the last time up until a couple of months ago. And she brought her class project from the class she took 18 years ago. She'd moved 6 times since then. I've moved twice since then, and I can't keep track of it. Where's my sweatshirt? That cool sweatshirt I've had for 40 years, I can't find it. And she kept track of this. And we all cried, and sea level rose 4 inches as a result. So I'm not fixing it at all. So for me, I'll continue to do the same kinds of things I'm doing now, doing presentations like this, teaching classrooms when I'm able. My partner and I have a workshop called the Only Love Remains workshop that we've facilitated a few times in Belize and in the United States. At some point, I'm going to do my last presentation. Look at my Photoshop. It's getting better already. And I will continue dancing till the bitter end. I don't know what to tell you, other than your time is short. I don't know when your expiration date is. I wish I did. I wish I knew when mine was. It'd make it easier to deal with the monetary system, wouldn't it? You know, if we knew with 6 months advance notice the day we were going to die, we could stop working then for sure. I'm not going to encourage you to overcharge your credit cards. Because we don't know the day, right? I think it's pretty soon as a result of any one of those half a dozen triggers that could cause loss of human habitat. It could be quite soon, but we don't know. We don't know when we're going to have an ice-free Arctic. We don't know when the monetary system is going to take a big dive. It's been far longer than I imagined already. What I would encourage you to do is to take the words of Homer seriously from 2,800 years ago and recognize that any moment might be your last. And that means the exhausting work of living with urgency. Thank you very much for bearing with me and through the technological challenges, and I would love to take a question or two. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McPherson. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to pass this love offering basket around to take a offering for Brian Kelly for their travels and their sustenance. And in Q&A, let's just open this up to a really wonderful dialogue. If you need to leave, don't feel bad. Otherwise, please stay and converse with us.
Yeah, so you didn't mention the Antarctic at all. Is that
Right.
just as, I mean, I've watched nature shows on the decline and the migration of the krill with the penguins feed on to different depths because the ocean temperatures have changed, and so they're starving because so that's just as urgent or dire as the melting of the Arctic sea ice, isn't it?
It's always a surprise to me when I'm no longer what Michael Mann called me years ago on the pages of the Washington Post, the doomist cult hero. It turns out that you're doomier than I am. I love it when that happens. Yes, Antarctica is the ice there is disappearing rapidly, and unlike the Arctic ice, which is floating, so when it melts, the sea level does not rise. In Antarctica, it's land ice, it's terrestrial ice, so when it melts, sea level rises. And it's been pointed out recently, again in the peer-reviewed literature, that big chunks of Antarctica are poised to fall into the ocean and might cause a very abrupt rise in sea level that would destroy industrial civilization. So yes, there's always one more thing. I've been on the road for a couple of weeks. I can't keep up. But the Arctic is the planetary air conditioner, and this is important to keep in mind. We are able to grow grains at scale because the grains are grown at scale in the northern hemisphere. And we have to keep the northern hemisphere cool and stable in terms of temperatures to support industrial civilization and any other version of civilization. There's very, very little grain grown in Australia, and that's about it. The grains are, for all practical purposes, grown in Asia, Europe, and North America. So having the planetary air conditioner keeping us cool is pivotal to the ability to keep growing those grains. So that's why I emphasize the Arctic. The Antarctic, it all matters. It's all bad. It sucks in every imaginable way. And there's always more. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
So I take it you're not a big fan of carbon sequestration and a technological fix?
I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan, but I don't see it happening. It's just too little, too late. First of all, civilization is a heat engine. And all of those strategies require maintenance of the heat engine known as civilization to operate. And so far, they are producing the ability to capture and store carbon at a very, very small level, not even able to keep up with the interest or the additional increase in carbon dioxide from year to year, much less biting into the principle that is the at least 100 parts per million that were over the 320 parts per million that James Hansen pointed out might be safe when he testified to Congress in 1988. So I conclude that it's too little too late. I would love to see that ramped up, but again, civilization is a heat engine, and that's just one of many triggers at this point. You know, I listed 6, maybe 7 that could take us over the edge. That's one. Yeah.
There's an article from today written by Dan Joling, who's an AP reporter. The headline is "Bering Sea Changes Startle Scientists, Worry Residents." It's about the lack of sea ice in the Bering Sea.
Right, I read that this morning. Mm-hmm.
Is that just more of the same, or is that something
Well,
out of the ordinary?
it's apparently out of the ordinary in that it shocks climate scientists, but where the hell have they been? Well, I've been writing about this for the last 10 years. I mean, how can you be shocked anymore about open water? There was open water in the Bering Sea a month ago the size of Montana. And that has never happened in the satellite record. Since 1979, we've never had that sort of opening before. How can you be shocked at this point that the entire Arctic is disintegrating, that the ice is going away? I don't know, but every time I read somebody from the Associated Press generally writing an article quoting a climate scientist, they're always stunned. Stunned, I tell you. Really? How could that be? And we've been down this road for a long time. We are in the midst of exponential climate change. What I call excremental climate change when I'm being less seemly. Yeah, they're in the back. John, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember it. Oh, so it's fascinating about turning the industry off, the negative consequences of that. Why aren't we hearing about that? I keep track of this stuff, this umbrella effect, the sulfates and aerosols. That's the most enlightening thing I've learned.
Yeah. Why aren't we hearing about that? Well, who would benefit from you knowing about the aerosol masking effect? That would be nobody except you. That certainly would not be the corporate media.
Just as a fact, I mean, you use the term paid climate scientists. I guess I'm wondering what that is. There must be others that work in academia that get paid, but they have no reason to lie or keep stuff from us. Is there this coalition of academic climate scientists that are withholding the other half of the story?
So here's a couple of examples. When Tim Garrett published that first paper indicating that civilization is a heat engine, it came out, it was initially published in November of 2008. And the outcry from the academic scientific community was enormous. They said, basically you're accusing us academics within the belly of the beast of civilization as being bad guys. And that can't possibly be right. So they screamed and hollered and jumped up and down, and the paper was pulled from publication. It no longer existed in the scientific record. It was published in among the most prestigious scientific journals that deal with climate change, a journal called Climatic Change. The editor was a very brave individual named Stephen Schneider, who happened to be on his deathbed when he had that paper published. It was pulled from publication and allowed to be published 14 months later, only with comments from 2 research groups publishing papers at the same time. So it came out in February of 2011, only if climatic change included these 2 responses. And Garrett was not allowed to comment on those 2. As near as I can tell, this is unprecedented in the history of the journal process. For the original author to not be able to comment on the 2 pieces that were written contra, and they didn't present any evidence that he was wrong. And he's published at least 2 papers since then.
What was the main finding?
That civilization is a heat engine based on the laws of thermodynamics. And that alone was enough to terrify people in the publishing community. In terms of the aerosol masking effect, it's stunning to me how little is known. James Hansen did an interview about a year after that December 2011 paper, the first one that I know about that came out about the aerosol masking effect. He did an interview about a year later, and to my knowledge has never spoken about it again. There was a BBC documentary put out in 2005, just a 57 or 58-minute documentary film about global dimming, 2005. It's been removed by YouTube within the last 6 months. You can no longer find it there. And I don't know of anybody who speaks openly about the aerosol masking effect except me, the co-host of my radio show, Kevin Hester, and our audiences are predictably small. I don't see anybody in the corporate media reporting on it ever. Even the science paper that came out February 8th of this year, you get something published in Science, that's a big deal. Nothing. Nothing in the popular media about it. Not a word. And that paper pointed out that the previous estimates were low, that this is really a big deal, folks, and that even slowing down the simmering pot that is industrial civilization is going to have untoward impacts. Nothing. The corporate media, nowhere to be found. The authors, as nearly as I can tell, are not talking about it. Tim Garrett's paper, the original one, is, I think, one of the most important papers in climate science. It's been cited about 30 times by other scientists. What is that? It doesn't exist because we pretend it doesn't exist? It's insane. So I can't explain it all, but there's no money to be made off of pointing out certain evidence.
And there's a lot to lose, I suppose.
And there's a lot to lose. There's a reason I'm speaking to small audiences. Yeah.
So actually, are you familiar with Orion magazine?
Yes.
There's an article written by someone in Ireland in this winter's issue that speaks exactly to what you're talking about.
Yes.
Paul Kingsnorth,
Yes.
are you familiar with that?
Oh, yes.
And he talks about the lie of hope, and he talks, like there's a quote here, the collapse of the industrial economy is in all likelihood the only remaining way to prevent mass destruction of life on Earth, but we're not sure about that. But,
No, we are sure. It goes the opposite of what he just wrote.
right, so this is the only thing that I read that you're speaking the same language and saying the same things, and he gives some really big or heavy facts in this about species extinction and the trajectory that we've been on for the last centuries, and compares it to other mass extinctions.
Right.
And numbers on species loss over the decades, and it speaks to just exactly what you're talking about.
Right. Kingsnorth is one of the founders of the Dark Mountain Project. They've written at least 3 book-length pieces on the topic of civilization and its dark underbelly. And I was asked to write an essay for the first one, which they rejected because it was too dark for the Dark Mountain Project. And I submitted one to the second one, and again, it was too dark for the Dark Mountain Project. So I would say Kingsnorth is catching up partially, but he goes down the same road that Deep Green Resistance and Idle No More go down, in that we just need to destroy civilization and then it'll all be solved. No, destroying civilization drives extinction even faster. And so he, again, fails to point that out. He's been stuck in the same diatribe for the last 15, 20 years. Same with Derek Jensen, same with the folks at Idle No More. No, no, no. And Kingsnorth, some of you might be familiar with David Wallace Wells. He had the most read piece in New York Magazine in their history, and his book just came out. He's on speaking tour pretty much 24/7. His book is called The Uninhabitable Earth, which might make you think that if the Earth is uninhabitable, maybe we couldn't inhabit it. So it might point towards human extinction, but in fact he uses the 2100 canard like almost everybody else. And he interviewed me for the piece in New York Magazine, and he mentions me and Kingsnorth in the book. He interviewed my partner and I when we were living in Belize and plagiarized us heavily, used exactly our words, and didn't attribute either of us. And in his book, he attempts a major hit piece on me and Kings North. He calls us climate Gnostics who have given up, and all kinds of other horrible things, mostly about me, because that's everybody's favorite thing to do. You can see why, because I'm kind of an ass. I mean, look at what I'm saying here. So, Kings North comes close. He really does. But we've known about the aerosol masking effect, we've known about global dimming for a while. 2005, if you go to the BBC, popularization of science about it. And then if you go to the science, it goes back to December 2011. That's 7.5 years now. And there have been a few papers published since then, including in Science, the leading scientific journal ever anywhere, 2 months ago, and crickets. Nothing from the media. Nothing at all. Nothing from the governments. You think the governments don't know about this? Of course they know. They got thousands of agents, analysts who are paid just to understand this information. Why don't you know about it? Because it is not in the literature. It's nowhere to be found. Nobody's going to tell you that we're about to lose habitat for humans on this planet. You might stop shopping. The government's one size fits all to all problems. Keep shopping. Yeah.
The thermodynamics that you mentioned, the guy who was, said that the masking effect is, civilization.
Right, Tim Garret.
Can you give me examples of exactly what he means by that? I mean, say we get everything on renewables and we're using all the clean energy
Right.
we possibly can. What is it that we're doing that's creating?
Well, where do the renewables come from? They're really derivatives. They're not renewables. They're derivatives. They're derived from fossil fuels. Where does solar panel come from? The solar panel fairy doesn't show up and just drop them. Same with wind power. Turbines don't just, if you put a quarter under your bed under your pillow when you go to sleep at night, you don't get a wind turbine the next morning. These things require an enormous amount of fossil fuels to construct and maintain. And perhaps more importantly is maintenance of the grid, which is all wires. Above ground, below ground, it's all wires. What maintains those wires? What maintains that infrastructure? Liquid fuels, pure and simple. Electric cars are never going to be able to drive the thousands of miles it takes, or even the hundreds of miles it takes to maintain the electrical grid on the interstate highway system. So that's what he's referring to, is the whole system, the whole of it, not just the bits and pieces that deal with electricity, for example, or with the fuels, or with the making of concrete, which is a huge contributor to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but the whole system. And so he takes, and he really gets lambasted by economists because he's not an economist, but he's looking at this from a systems viewpoint and going where no economist will go, basically, which is to connect a few dots leading to the overheating of the planet. It's easy to find his work. Tim Garret, University of Utah, will take you to a bunch of articles. All the ones by economists are hit pieces who don't point out any evidence. And he has a great little piece on his blog, Nepholog or something like that, where he explains in considerable detail for the layperson what he means by civilization as a heat engine. So he could do it much better justice than I just did.
Thank you.
Could you explain the aerosol masking effect?
Of course. And this is very challenging. And I know it's very challenging. There's a guy named Peter Miller who's a psychologist in Edmonton. And he talked to me 7 times for 2 hours and 1 time for an hour. So he talked to me for 15 hours. And it took him 14 hours to understand the aerosol masking effect. So There's no, and he's a smart guy, and he did a bunch of homework. He talked to me for 2 hours. The first time he talked to me for 2 hours, and he said, okay, that's it. You've answered my every question. I'm never going to talk to you again. And he said that 7 more times. And I've no doubt the phone will be ringing as soon as I get done here. Because this is difficult, and it goes against everything we've ever heard. The government, the media, they still tell us on a daily basis we need to reduce emissions or we're in real trouble, right? You hear that all the time. But if we reduce emissions...
Is that our government telling us?
Okay, not so much anymore.
So you mean Trump was right all along?
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting because at some level, yes, coal is king. And I hate saying that because I'm not a fan of this set of living arrangements, which drives to extinction 200 species every day, which fouls the air and dirties the water and washes the soil into the ocean. We're destroying every aspect of the living planet. We're just grinding it into dust. I'm not a fan of this set of living arrangements, of what we call civilization, quite affectionately, I might add. It's horrible. And yet, and so that's why I went off-grid. That's why I led the way, away from civilization. Everybody follow along. Look, I'm showing you the way. I can grow food now. I can store the food. I can preserve it. I can do all these things. Look at me, I'm milking goats. And it's a good thing nobody followed, because then we would have lost the aerosol masking effect, and I guarantee we wouldn't be having this conversation today.
Okay, explain it.
Okay, so we all know about greenhouse gases, right? Mm-hmm. Most people didn't know that the most abundant is water vapor, accounting for 93% of the greenhouse gases by volume in the atmosphere. We think of carbon dioxide as being the bad guy, and methane most of us know about as being another bad guy. And how do they act? Well, is anybody parked in the sun? Anybody parked in the sun?
Sun?
Yeah, parked in the sun right now. You parked your car in the sun. Okay, so a couple of people back there in the back parked in the sun. And when you go get into your car, what's it going to feel like inside? It's going to be nice. Not warm. It's going to be nice, like that. Nice, okay? It's going to be really warm and nice because your car is a greenhouse on wheels. The incoming radiation, the solaration, the sunlight, we'll call it, for simplicity, the sunlight comes in, and the long-wave radiation gets trapped in there. The short-wave radiation escapes out the windows, but the long-wave radiation doesn't. It gets trapped. That's because the windows are like blankets, and we keep putting blankets up. That's what this is supposed to show. These global warming blankets, methane, carbon dioxide, and chlorofluorocarbons, and ozone, a whole bunch of others are greenhouse gases that trap that heat. And that's what your car is doing. It's trapping that heat in the car. At the same time that industrial activity produces those greenhouse gases, the effects of which are realized for at least the next 1,000 years, the current level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere guarantees 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise and staying there for at least 1,000 years. Industrial activity also does something else. Something really good for us, not something really bad for us in that it warms the planet, but something really good for us in that it puts these sulfates up there in the atmosphere, or the aerosols up in the upper atmosphere, that keep the sunlight from coming in at all. Imagine that instead of parking in the sun, you park in the shade. That's the aerosol masking effect. Everybody who parked in the shade parked under an umbrella. So when you get in your car, it's going to be cold because you had an umbrella over you. Currently, the planet has an umbrella over it, comprised mostly of sulfates, comprised of aerosols, and thus the term the aerosol masking effect. And those aerosols are constantly falling out of the atmosphere. In fact, James Hansen, in that first interview, which came out in December, was conducted in December 2012. It was actually put online in early January 2013. And he says it takes 5 days for those to all fall out. So if we turn off the switch of civilization, if we stop burning coal and natural gas and gasoline and oil, if we stop burning everything, it all falls out in 5 days. The scientific consensus since then is that it falls out in about 6 weeks. But does it really matter whether it's 5 days or 6 weeks? In any event, it's a very short period of time, much shorter than any growing season, much shorter. So we're going to experience, should they all fall out? Should we turn off the switch or even reduce the switch? As little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity causes a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise. So fast that there's no way any organism on the planet can keep up. They depend upon the interconnected relationships they have with the fungi in the soil, the structure of the soil itself, the plants that are growing there. Every critter on the planet depends upon a whole bunch of other critters on the planet just to survive, as well as the soil matrix. So if we suddenly flip a switch from simmer to fast boil, that's what the aerosol masking, removal of the aerosol masking effect does.
Where do the sulfides in the aerosol masking effect come from?
From industrial activity. So the best example is coal. Poor quality coal is high in sulfur. And anthracite, clean coal, is very low in sulfur. That's where the sulfates come from. You burn coal, especially bad coal, it puts a lot of sulfates into the atmosphere because the sulfur that is burned interacts with the oxygen to form sulfates, SO4, I think. So you burn that coal, it puts sulfur, it burns the sulfur and therefore puts sulfates into the atmosphere.
So
That-
is coal the only source of sulfate?
No. There's sulfur in all the fossil fuels. So if it were just a coal problem, that would be one thing, but it's not. It's every time you fire up the internal combustion engine in your car, that also produces some sulfur. I use coal as the example because it's the simplest example. Most people know about clean coal as opposed to the other stuff, and the other stuff most of us know is high in sulfur.
But it's only fossil fuels.
What about volcano?
Yes, volcanoes would do the trick as well. There's sulfur that is emitted by, and you tell this anytime you're tapping into hot springs or geothermal water, it has a sulfury smell, right? And that's because of the volcanic activity that's related. So there are natural processes that are responsible for sulfates as well.
I just want to interject real fast. We have 15 minutes to exit the building, and we've got 2 hands up, and then I'd like us to talk briefly on our response to this information, forward action for our community, et cetera. So we've got Richard.
Richard?
What's the connection between sulfates and aerosol?
Sulfates are one form of aerosols. There are other aerosols that I cannot name. So sulfates is the generic term. Sorry, aerosols is the generic term. Just when I'm trying to unconfuse the process, I throw in the wrong word like that. So aerosols is the generic term. And it includes dust particles as well. So it includes physical particles as well. Okay? So that's included in the aerosols.
Okay.
And,
Pollution.
right, so it's pollution. And so sulfates is the dominant member of aerosols produced by industrial activity. But I'm trying to not use them as pseudonyms because they're not, but I'm also trying to keep this reasonably simple because it's not.
You have a question in the back?
Kingsnorth mentions peat, because peat is being real, he says even dirtier than coal, and that most of Ireland's peat, that's their main source of fuel, and it's almost all gone, I think. But he mentions it, as a big contributor, he said it's getting dirtier than coal.
Right.
Yeah,
And it's probably a good thing. Paradoxically.
yeah.
I was in Ireland many years ago, and they actually go out into these peat bogs when they're dry and carve these big chunks out of the ground and go and use them for heating their fires. And it's really a remarkable process, and to think that people are doing that who are older than me is kind of astonishing. And it's quite a natural process. It's what humans have been doing for literally thousands of years there. And the mere thought of taking that away, of not being able to burn peat in their fireplaces, is enough to cause a civil war. And I've no doubt that it's, quote, dirtier than coal, because just as clean coal, anthracite, has less sulfur in it than dirty coal, which is not as dense and has sulfur, I've no doubt that if we go further down the spectrum to more carbon, more sulfur, that it gets dirtier and dirtier. But as it turns out, because of the catch-22, that's not necessarily a bad thing from a human perspective or from a heating the planet perspective. So we're really living on borrowed time. If the upper limit for humans is, say, 2.7 degrees, a degree, and we don't even know what it is, right? We're at 1 3/4 now, probably a little higher. We don't know the point at which we lose humans, but I've no doubt that it will be because of a rapid increase in temperature, because the rate is so important. But we don't know where that is. And I'm not counting, people living in a nuclear submarine eating Soylent Green as maintaining habitat for humans. And that's actually been proposed by a climate scientist who will remain nameless.
So this is a good point to ask the questions. What is our response? How do we receive these needs? And how do we go forward in our days? What are the markers and the indicators that we are paying attention to in our community that cause us to say, that dude was right? What are the markers? We have this blue ocean event, when the Arctic ice is less than 1 million square kilometers, that is called a blue ocean event, and that will have already triggered the feedback loops, which we think are already well triggered many years ago, over 6 dozen now. And the time that's coming could be rapid, right? Because it's all about rate. I don't know if we got that today. I've heard, this is the 4th or 5th time I've heard Dr. McPherson in person, and I follow him on the internet. And the rate of change is exponential. So when things start happening, they're gonna happen quickly. We're already seeing catastrophe in the Midwest. It's predicted to go through the summer with diminished grain production. We will see prices for food increasing, so that would be one indicator for us in our community. Food prices have gone up, right? So these are things we'll hear in the news. Blue ocean, food prices, we'll see that, we'll feel that.
So I think what Ms. Garrett is asking, no relation to Tim?
No relation to
Okay, no known relation. Is how does this make you feel? What does this make you want to do? Besides throw me out the window. Like I haven't heard that one before. I would hope this would make you want to track down some evidence. Right? So you can go online and type in how Guy McPherson gets it wrong, and you'll see all kinds of horrible things written about me from many years ago.
I think what shocks me is we're still in denial, like across the board, everywhere. It's like I've never ever in my entire life seen so many scientists from so many walks of studies. It doesn't matter what kind of scientists they are. They all agree. And it's like there's still, I swear the doubters outweigh the science. It's like, and maybe, and is it because I think as a society we truly have been trained to be hopeful, where it's just like being a parent. When a child comes in and something's really wrong, you always say, it's okay, it's gonna be all right. That's how we are trained as humans, or even as leaders. And you don't want a leader that's doom and gloom. They even in leadership schools, they're like, whatever you do, when you're leading the troop, you don't let them see what you really think or believe. You must be optimistic. I think we must be countering those. I think that's what I like the most about your discussions. You kind of got into this psychology of why we refuse to acknowledge what's really going on everywhere around us. And we see the signs, and they are more, I think they're more evident every day. I watched the whole mass die-off of every coastal Alaskan water with all the birds collapsing, and finally the next year, the fishermen were like, gee, wow, the cod are gone too.
Right.
And grocery owners are like going, wow, there's no fishermen anymore, and our profits have fallen 50%. It's like, people still aren't waking up. They go, well, it'll get better in a few days or years.
Yeah. You're right. A couple of 3 weeks ago, I was on the campus at Boston College University. I was hosted by a professor of theology. I want you to let that sink in for a minute. And I'm an atheist, and so is he. He doesn't tell his students that. Oddly enough, he's at Boston College, a Catholic school, and he doesn't tell his students that he's an atheist, and he's become... Oh yeah. And we had this great conversation. He knows everything about the Bible. He knows all these biblical prophecies. So almost every sentence that I said, he'd say, oh yeah, and then there's John 14:27 with birds falling out of the air, and then there's Ezekiel this, and blah, blah, Isaiah that. And he's just incredibly up to date. And it's biblical, as you point out. It's biblical what's going on right now. 25 years ago, I'd give a presentation like this one, typically to my colleagues, and somebody would come up afterwards and they'd say, why aren't you running for office? And I'd say, did you not hear a word I said? If you want Mr. Dome, I'm your guy. Nobody's going to vote for me. Are you out of your mind?
So let me just say, I plan to have a political future in Alaska. I started many years ago doing political type stuff. And those of you who know me know that I'm not your mainstream politician. So one thing that I'm into with the climate change science is the reality and the truth, and from a leadership seat presenting that. And it's not to save people. None of my mission is to save your lives. My mission is to empower people to live fuller, more present, more authentic, more beautiful lives, following their heart's blisses, right? And so that's the kind of leader that I intend to be if time and the feedback loops permit that I run for governor one day. I better do it the next go around, I guess. Yeah, but anyway, I just thank you very much, Dr. McPherson and Pauline, for coming up to Alaska to spend time with us in Fairbanks and in Juneau. Yeah.
Cachet.
Cachet is the shaker and mover behind this entire part of the tour. She brought us to Fairbanks, and she brought us to Juneau, and then we're headed for California as the next 3 weeks of this 5-week tour. And Cachet is a graduate student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and it was all her who brought us on campus a couple of times at Fairbanks and to the libraries here.
Just as a concerned
House for
citizen.
everything.
Yeah, and more of us need to be concerned citizens, but we need to drop the hopeful dialect that we're using, because we've talked about, let's get together, people, and the past 25 years have been more damaging to the planet than all the years before that, the last 25 years. And the last 25 years is when we've all been activated to be environmentalists. It's not working. It's not working. I'm not saying it's time to lay down and die, but it's time to accept that we need to initiate planetary hospice for each other and to heal our broken relationships.